This video will address the removal and installation of mounted ball bearings. Mounted ball bearings may be used on various sections of equipment, but they all follow the same general removal and installation steps. Prior to working on any equipment, follow your local lockout-tagout procedure. In order to remove bearings from some locations of the equipment, you will need to remove other components first. This will commonly be either a drive sprocket or overhung gearbox. Once those components have been removed, the next step is to remove the end cap on the bearing if one is present. Some polymer caps may require the use of a screwdriver to pry on a removal nub or drain hole to pry the cap off the housing. For bolt-on end caps, the use of an Allen wrench will be needed. If you intend to reuse the cap, be sure to retain the screws. Once the end cap has been removed, the locking mechanism should be accessible. For Setscrew Locking bearings, the use of an Allen wrench will be needed to loosen the two set screws. For collar-mounted bearings, there is typically a single fastener that needs to be loosened. This may be an Allen head or Torx head depending on the collar design. Once the fastener is loose, the collar can be slid off the bearing. After loosening the shaft locking mechanism, the next step is to loosen and remove the housing from the equipment frame. However, this will result in the shaft being unsupported, which could cause injury or machine damage. The use of a support block, straps, or some other method to support the shaft should be reviewed prior to loosening the mounting bolts. In some cases, a window in the belting may be needed to access the mounting bolts. At this point, the housing mounting bolts can be loosened and removed. The bearing can be slid off the end of the shaft. If the bearing is not able to slide, the use of a bearing puller may be needed. Once the bearing has been removed from the shaft, inspect it for wear or damage. If there are nicks, burrs, surface fretting, or high spots, they should be smoothed out as much as possible. If there are sections of the shaft that look worn or damaged, measure them with a micrometer to see if the shafting is still within specification or needs to be replaced. For shafting tolerance information, refer to the installation instructions provided with the bearing. Shafting worn as shown will need to be replaced. When complete, the shafting should look clean as shown. You are now ready to start installing the new bearing onto the equipment. Some flanged bearings may come with a backside shield. Slide it onto the shaft first. If there is a section cut out of the shield, this should be installed in the down position as shown and will act as a drain to minimize moisture buildup between the bearing and the shield. Slide the bearing onto the shaft and push it up against the equipment mounting frame. If you have difficulty getting the bearing to slide down the shaft, do not use hammers, as that can damage the bearing. Use a file and emery cloth to remove burrs, nicks, or high spots on the shaft. Remember that the shaft diameter needs to be within specification. Once the bearing is in position, install the mounting bolts and tighten them down. Refer to the bolt manufacturer or equipment manufacturer for the recommended tightening torque. Repeat the installation steps for the second bearing, but when the housing bolts are installed, do not tighten them down all the way yet. For some equipment, there are fixed mounting hole locations where the bolts can be tightened all the way. If there is play or adjustment capability between the bearing and the frame, before tightening the housing bolts, verify the bearings and shaft are in proper alignment for the application conditions. Most mounted bearings can self-align within the housing as shown, and typically have 1.5 to 2 degrees of static alignment capability, depending on the manufacturer. Once alignment is complete, tighten the housing mounting bolts to the same torque as bearing 1. To verify the installation is correct, rotate the shaft by hand in both directions to make sure it turns smoothly with no binding. Before locking the bearings to the shaft, adjust the shaft position as needed to make sure there will be room for a closed end cap if one is planned to be used. Now that everything is in position, the shaft locking mechanism can be tightened. Typically, mounted bearings are locked to the shaft by set screws or a concentric locking collar. Both will be covered in this video. For Setscrew Locking bearings, align the inner ring so there is easy access to the mounting screws, in this case at the 12 and 4 o'clock positions. The use of a torque wrench is recommended to verify that set screws are tightened to the proper torque. Set the torque wrench to 1/2 the bearing instructions recommended torque value and tighten one of the screws. Set the torque wrench to the full torque value and tighten the second screw, and then tighten the first screw. Visually note the position of the screws and direction they are pushing the shaft before going to the second bearing. Before tightening the screws of the second bearing, hold the shaft and rotate the inner ring so the screws are pushing the shaft the same direction as the first bearing. Repeat the steps used for tightening the screws of the first bearing. When complete, rotate the shaft by hand in both directions to make sure it turns smoothly with no binding. For Skwezloc locking bearings, slide the collar onto the inner ring if needed. The cap screw should be on the right-hand side when facing the bearing. Make sure the collar is flush against the inner ring. If it is not flush, push on it to align it properly as shown. Set the torque wrench to the bearing instructions' recommended torque value. Hold the collar tightly against the inner ring and tighten the cap screw. When complete, turn the shaft by hand and visually inspect the collar as it rotates. It should turn evenly with no wobble. If there is some wobble in the collar, loosen the cap screw, align the collar, and repeat the tightening process. Repeat this process for the second bearing. Before installing the end cap, line up the mounting bolt holes with the housing and rotate the cap such that a drain hole will be in the down position. Press the cap against the housing. Install and tighten the cap screws. Once complete, verify the drain hole is in the down position. Rotate the shaft by hand to make sure there is no contact with the end cap. For open end caps, there is a seal that slides over the shaft. While holding the seal with the thick end away from the cap, slide the seal down the shaft until the seal lip is against the face of the end cap. The seal thick end should be roughly 1/4 inch from the end cap face. The bearings are now completely installed. When the machine is turned back on, observe the bearings to make sure nothing is out of the ordinary and there are no noises or contact between the shaft and end caps.